So next is our fundamental aspects of our documentary credits, our principle of autonomy, and the standard for examination of documents. So under our Article 4 of the UCP, a credit by its nature is a separate transaction from the sale or other contract on which it may be based. The contract between the agreement between the parties, the buyer and the seller, is solely separate from the transaction or the agreement between the issuing endorser or si buyer and his issuing bank or ang iyang intermediary through which ang documentary credit is mag-undertake sa principal duty ni issuing bank. And also, that agreement is separate from the agreement on which type sang documentary credit na paggamiton sang method of payment between kay buyer and kay seller. And an issuing bank should discharge any attempt by the applicant or by the buyer to include as an integral part of the credit. The next one is our standard for examination of documents, which is under our Article 14 of the UCP. So first is a nominated bank acting on its nomination, and the issuing bank must examine a presentation to determine on the basis of documents alone whether or not the documents appear on their face to constitute a complying transaction. So, diba, under our undertakings by the confirming and issuing bank to honor the credit if it is available by its either acceptance, negotiation, deferred payment. The previous negotiation is included or involved si nominated bank whether if i-honor niya ang undertaking or i-honor niya or hindi niya pag-i-honor ang undertaking. So, here, if ever that the nominated bank honor the credit and he will make a payment to the seller, that nominated bank will be reimbursed by our issuing bank. Under if that nominated bank forwarded the documents, all of the legal documents and complying transactions nga evidence nga naghatag siya or make siya payment kay seller. So, the issuing bank will investigate or examine the presentation of the nominated bank. And if ever that presentation is complying or the issuing bank approve the presentation of the nominated bank, it will reimburse the nominated bank. The second one is that if a nominated bank acting on its nomination and the issuing bank shall each have a maximum of 5 banking days following the day of presentation to determine if a presentation is complying. So, if a nominated bank is acting or presenting on its nomination and gain except in an issuing bank, the nominated bank has may ara siya 5 days following of presentation to comply for the presentation or to comply such documents nga mag-approve nga si nominated bank is nag-make or nag-distribute payment ni buyer kay seller. And also our standard for examination of documents is also under sa aton nga Article 5 of the UCP, which states that banks deal with documents and not with goods. Diba? Trading could be finance around value or time and the kind of commodity of which both parties trade. It could be goods or service, but the bank is solely not affect or wala labot si bank kung ano madayang i-trade ni seller and ni buyer. The solely the solely nga care ni bank is ang documentary credit, ang method of financing, ang documentary bill or documentary credit, which is under sa presentation nga payment or with regards to the payment of the buyer kay seller. So the bank deals with documents, not with goods, services, or performance. So that's our fundamental aspects of our documentary credits. Next is the governing law of our documentary credits. So sa atong mga organization, mga past discussions, there are laws na govern. Also, with regards sa ating documentary credits, there are rules, regulations, also provided by our UCP 600. So, in our transactions between or with regards sa ating documentary credit, may ara kita na form a relationship. For relationship, first is the buyer and the issuing bank relationship. The buyer and the issuing bank, ang relationship nila is that si buyer mag-i-issue sang credit or sang iyang payment kay issuing bank, and that issuing bank will have a relationship between the seller kay si issuing bank ipagahatag niya o duly honored niya ang i-withdraw na credit ni seller as a payment of the buyer. The issuing and confirming bank, which could transfer its principal duties kay confirming bank, at si confirming bank ang pwede na magbayad kay issuing bank. That is under our confirmed credit type of documentary credit. The third one is the confirming bank and the seller. Si confirming bank maghatag na sa payment kay seller. And last is the issuing bank and the seller. Under our Article 4 of Rome Convention, the most useful provision in identifying the governing law of documentary credits are: first is the extent that the law applicable to the contract has not been chosen. So the contract shall be governed by the law of the country which it is most related to. So if there are chaos, if there are difficulties with the agreement, especially if one party become default or non-performance ang isa ka party, ang mag-govern na law is ang country which it is most relevant or related to between the seller and the buyer. Remember our undertakings on how to confirm as ating operation sa ating documentary credit, on how we confirm or when we have to confirm the credit is that diba dapat stable ang political state, ang economic growth is stable, and there are no chaos in that such country. So that standard will be applied on this governing law. Kung ano ang country na amo sinabi between kay seller and the buyer, probably or maga-prevail ina nga law between sa difficulties nga situation ni seller and ni buyer. The next one is it shall be presumed that the contract is most closely connected with the country who is to affect the performance which is characteristics of the contract has. So, i-assume sang both parties nga mas apektado o mas kinahanglan ina nga agreement or ina nga trading sang mini nga party. For example, mas kinahanglan ni buyer ang ini nga agreement compare kay seller. Kay probably si seller ina nga goods or ina nga service is gina-trade niya man sa pila ka bansa o pila ka country. So, si buyer is solely depend kay seller. So, between the two, mas kinahanglan ni buyer ang mina nga goods or mina nga trade. So, it will be presumed that the contract is most closely connected sa kay buyer nga country. And that's the governing law of our documentary credit states under our Article 4 nga since it is most closely connected with the country or kay buyer nga country. The law nga mag-govern is the law of the buyer country. So that's the governing law with regards sa aton nga documentary credits. So the last topic for our documentary credits are the standby credits, performance bonds, and guarantees. So these three are second liability of the bank when it comes or when both parties are in a situation wherein one party becomes in default. Usually si buyer which is nag-default sa iya nga pagbayad kay seller. So we have standby credit, performance bonds, and guarantees. First is our standby credit. So it is issued by a bank and embodies an undertaking to make payment to a third party or to accept bills of exchange drawn on his or her. It is given by any of security with the intention that it should only be drawn if the party by whom the work should be done defaults in the performance of his or her contractual obligation to the beneficiary or to the seller. So from it words na standby credit, standby, which means gahulat lang siya. So meaning, this may be called upon by tendering any specified documents without the beneficiary having to prove actual default. Meaning, this type of credit gives a 100% assurance kay seller na makuha niya ng Japon ang bayad ni buyer even hindi ma-prove ni buyer, ni seller rather, na si buyer is nag-default na sa pagbayad sa iya. Next one is ang performance bonds and guarantees. So unless a standby credit that there is no such evidence na kinahanglan nga ipag-present ni seller kay issuing bank in order to him to withdraw the standby credit or to withdraw the payment of the buyer, there is a performance bonds is may ara written demand nga iga-present si seller kay issuing bank or kay confirming bank para makuha niya ang bayad ni buyer, which is if a written demand is usually signed by the both parties from their agreement or from the terms under sa ilang letter of credit nga if mag-default si buyer sa pagbayad, there is a assurance na makuha ni seller ang bayad ni buyer through a performance guarantee. So these are our documentary credits topics. The types, the undertaking laws, the governing law, and the principal autonomy, and also our standby credits and the performance bonds and guarantees, which is crucial and significant for the methods of financing under this chapter, the role of the seller and buyer or the exporting country and the importing country when it comes to trading under sa ilang na agreement or under sa ilang specified agreement between the parties. Ini lang sa ato nga documentary credit is may ara kita nga intermediary which is usually an permit or may ara bigya sa intermediary in any case sa agreement or sa trade or transaction, especially when it comes to exchange, diba? It has usually under sa atong financial market, di ba, gamit sa atong financial market, may aragid yung intermediary na maga-between or maga-settle that sang transaction between sa two parties which is ang bank. So, muna siya atong documentary credits.